First, I'd like to talk to you about the various materials that go into making this peplum in the style I'm going to show you. Obviously, you need a fashion fabric, which in this case, I've got a black on black jacquard damask style pattern. On the back, I've got a similar but not exactly the same woven black on black jacquard as well. It's much thinner than the front fabric. My decorative trim, this is actually a replica pattern from a portrait of Catherine Parr. I just loved it, and I had the trim made to be a replica of that pattern. It's embroidered rather than a woven trim on a black satin ground with gold thread, and it's got fusible interfacing on the back, which helps in placement. I also have on either side of that trim a very narrow, it's a polyester twist cord. I have a whole roll of it, so I don't worry too much about how much I'm using and where. I like the effect that it gives. It both trims out the edge and gives it a little tiny bit of dimension, and I did this on either side of the trim to help attach it to the peplum and give it some sort of an edge that I'd like it to have. I also have on the front bias tape. I had a roll of black satin bias tape. You don't have to use anything that's pre-made on a roll, but I had it in the right color and in a fabric that I wanted to use for this project, so it worked awfully well to do that. So that's all of the materials that you can see on the peplum, but it does have a couple of layers inside to give it structure. The main and most important, I think, thing is this fabric right here, this interfacing. It's hair canvas. It's called tailoring canvas. It's got a couple of different brand names that it's sold under. It's Hymo or Acro, and it's sold either fusible with a glue on one side, a fusible glue on one side, or this one is actually sew-in. I'm not a great big fan of the glue that comes on the fusible ones. I prefer a stronger adhesive if I'm going to use a fusible. And in fact, I am using a fusible for this project. For this one, I'm using Heat and Bond Light. The light just means that it is a little less stiff when you get it all said and done. I still would like it to feel like fabric and not quite like cardboard when it's all done. It's got paper on one side and an adhesive looking on the other, and you can draw right on the paper and then iron that on and peel off the paper, and I'll show you how to use that later. The first thing we want to do is to draw out my pattern piece onto the fusible Heat and Bond Light. So what I've done here, you may be able to see that I've already drawn my pattern lines on here. With fusible interfacing, it's not really fabric, it's just glue, so you're not as worried about grain or direction. So I can cut this peplum this way, and I can draw it, and the second one nestled right up against it that way, and the same over here. My patterns, by the way, never have seam allowances on them. This is a couture and theatrical way to work, so that I can put different seam allowances different places. So what you see here is the finished shape of the peplum, and in this case I would like the fusible and the canvas to only be the shape of the finished shape of the peplum with nothing going into seam allowances, because that would make it really thick. I'm just going to cut out one of those. I do need to be careful with that cutting, because this shape is my exact shape of my pattern. And I do need it to be exact, because it's how I'm going to make sure that the shape stays true. After I have drawn out my pattern onto the Heat and Bond Light and cut out the shape, I've still got the fusible side on one side, I've still got the paper on the other. I'm going to lay it onto my hair canvas. In this case, I'm going to lay it with the sort of stripe, the obvious stripe part of the fabric, going up and down, because that is the way that this particular interfacing is going to help me the best. The reason is the animal hair, the goat hair that is in this fabric, doesn't like to bend, so it's going in this direction only, whereas other fibers are going this way, so this fabric would bend nicely or scrunch up nicely that way. But if I try to bend it this way, I'm only going to get a large gentle curve, and that is one of the main advantages of this fabric, is you can use those properties to help you do whatever it is you need to do. So since I want the peplums to bend smoothly around the body, But to stay nice and not get scrunched up like when they sit down or something, I'm going to put these lines up and down on these particular, on this particular project. So I am carefully cutting this line, and I'm cutting the seam allowance off all the way around. This is just the structure part of the peplum. It's not actually anything I want to have any of this thick or glued surface go into the seam allowance, so I need to make sure it doesn't go into the seam allowance. Then I can peel back the paper, and that reveals the other side of the glue, which is nice and even and not so light, not so heavyweight that once it's glued, the peplums still won't have some life to them. So I've got a little chunk of my fashion fabric piece here, and I've just got a motif kind of nicely centered on that. And you do have to be careful. This particular fabric and so many others have a right side and a wrong side. In this case, this one side of the fabric has a shiny background and a dark black pattern, and the other side has a dark black background and a shiny pattern. On the doublet, I used the shiny background and the dark black pattern. So that's what I want to also do here. So my pattern has a very obvious center point to it. I can just fold it in half to find the center of that peplum, make sure that I am on the center of my pattern, and double check my points. This black fabric is a little soft, which is why I'm putting the structure on in the first place. So I just want to get it nice and centered and then fused on. I hit the steam button just out of habit. Now I have to make sure it's nice and ironed dry. Next thing I'm going to do is to trim away all the excess except for at the top of the peplum, because that is where I need to leave seam allowance. So I'm going to leave all of that up there for right now. I'm just going to get this trimmed off, and then I'll turn it over and look at it and see how I did with the centering of the pattern. Looks pretty good. So the next step will be to go to the sewing machine and sew myself a guideline. It'll be a ½ inch in my case, a ½ inch in from the edge, and it'll just be a straight stitch, 1, 2, 3, to give myself some guidance for where to place my trim. And also using a machine stitch to go all the way through to attach these two layers together permanently. Okay, I'm back from my machine, and as you see, I have a neatly stitched line of top stitching that goes through and through, exactly a ½ inch in from the edge on those three sides. I'm going to use those as placement lines for this fusible trim. I'm going to use this guideline of stitching to be able to place my pattern centered on the motif of the peplum and right up against that stitch line, and then because it's got fusible on the back, I can just ask it to stay right in place. So I'm taking the iron only to that stitching line on the one side and then on the other side. So now I just need to turn this and miter the corner, and because it's fused on in that way, and I can set a nice crease there and then be able to very easily get a lovely miter and lay it right up against my guiding stitches there and fuse that piece on as well. Now this glue, as I think I've said before, should not be relied on to stay permanent. This is just keeping this in place before we can get a stitch in it, which will keep it on forever and ever. Nice crease to start. Right up against that guideline. Good time to double check your pattern placement. It looks nice and centered to me. Next thing I will do is go back to the machine, and I will zigzag my polyester twisted cord onto the edge, outside and inside edge of this. At the same time, I'll be doing a zigzag stitch to hold this piece onto all of the layers of fabric. So with one stitch on the outside and one stitch on the inside, I will both decorate and attach this trim to the peplum. Okay, back from the sewing machine, I have zigzagged on the cording on the edge and zigzagged that to the trim all the way through to the fabric. Here's what it looks like on the back. You can see my original straight stitch, which was my placement line, and then the zigzag line really spans that, holding the little cord that you can maybe see up here onto the edge, and with a zigzag stitch holding the trim on. The next thing to do will be to put the lining on the back, and that's really an easy thing to do actually. Here's my lining fabric. Just going to give it a little press. It does have a right and a wrong side as well, so I need to be making sure that looks like the right side to me, so we'll put that one face down, and then we'll lay this on top of there. All I need to do with this is I'm going to pin this in place, and then I'm going to go back to the machine and do a little straight stitch 1/8 of an inch in from the edge of my piece, and that will just hold all the layers together. Then I will trim off all of the excess. Okay, back from the sewing machine, I've got my little top stitched line all the way through. It's actually, when you line something like this without having stitched it and turned it inside out, it's called flat lining. So this is a nice flat lined peplum here. Now I'm just trimming off all of the extra fabric on all 4 sides. So I need them to be flush against the edge, even the top, because of course my pattern piece, we've still got the seam allowance that I built in from the fashion fabric layer. So we still have seam allowance for both that layer and that layer. This is all trimmed off. I'm ready to bind the edge with my bias. This is called single fold bias tape, even though it has 2 folds, because double fold bias tape would start like this and then it would have yet one more fold. So even though it has 2 folds, it's still single fold bias tape. However, it still has one more fold than I really want it to have. I'm going to press out one of the 2 folds because I don't want this little crease on this one end to affect where I stitch, and I'm only going to machine stitch one side of this, so I get rid of that, and then I'm just going to press it from the other side as well to make sure I've gotten rid of that crease and to really set the other side of the fold, which I do need. All right, I am ready to take these back to the sewing machine and bind the edge. In binding an edge, the important thing is that you keep your row of stitching nicely equidistant from the edge of the fabric. So I've got this lovely, I love this little seam guide thing. I would tell you what it's called. If I can find it, I'll put a link in the end. Really helps me, especially with something as thick as this already is, to just run that right against the seam guide, and I will get a nice consistent distance from the edge of my peplum. Okay, I'm going to stop with my needle down. Always a good trick so that you can fiddle with things and not mess up your stitching line. This is my corner, and I need to have the miter all arranged just like that before I get close to it. So I'm going to stop here and show you how I do that. So I take this row of the bias, and I'm going to fold it around the outside edge and give a really good finger press, and all I'm really looking for is that crease. And then I'm going to pin this in place a little above that, just so that that can't move. Now with that pinned in place and with my crease there, I'm now going to lay this side along the bottom edge of the peplum, but the crease is useful because I have to put that crease exactly on the corner point so that my miter that I'm lining up will have exactly enough fabric to make that turn, and so that it will point directly at the corner. And I pin that piece as well. All right, so I've got my little fold here. Next thing I need to do is lay this over sideways, and I'm gonna again give it a really good finger press. And now I'm going to want to stitch just until the point where I think you can see that that little diagonal line where my fold is. And this is definitely the tricky part because I need to be able to see that diagonal line, because what I want to do is I want to stitch until I get to here, and then I want one single stitch to catch that inner fold that I've got in there. And I'll show you why in just a moment. I'll leave that pin in until it starts to get in my way, and then I'm going to remove it. And I can see that little diagonal fold, so hopefully you can too. And I'm going to stitch until I think this is it. I have one stitch going into that fold, and then I'm going to back stitch a couple. But I can in fact see my one little tiny stitch that I took there. That's exactly what I want, because what I now need to do is line this up so that my needle goes in the exact same hole that stitch came out of. And then I'm going to stitch forward and back and then go down the rest of this row. When I turn this over the corner, I should get a beautiful, sharp miter point. And all I need to do is press out those two sides of that fold, and I am pretty happy with that right there. Let's check the other one. Those both look pretty good. I'll have to see if that one is lumpy or not. Yep, looks like I can make it look pretty great at the iron. All right, so those are my mitered corner tricks. Okay, back from the sewing machine, I've just completed my the front side of my mitered corners, which you do by sewing machine. And there's just a little work to do on the back before you can do the hand stitching. I like to hand stitch this edge to the lining. I just find that if I tried to stitch in the ditch with a machine, I'm not terribly great at that, and I end up spending more time taking stitches out than I would if I just hand stitched in the first place. So that's just something I always like to hand stitch. All right, so the front of it is looking lovely now, and you just have to fold it around to the back. We have to set the miter on the back side as well. And so that's really simply done. If you get the front right, the back will just really kind of fall into place very nicely. You get it lined up. You're making sure you don't have any dips or divots there. You get a little, and you just press it in place. Check the front again. Looks good. Check the back. Looks good. If you like, you can line up this mitered edge right there so that it goes straight from there to the point. I may fiddle with that a little bit more, but honestly, it doesn't bother me too much. Pinning all of those sides down, making sure the other corner looks good from the front. It does. I'm gonna press it over. This is that other fold that I wanted to leave in there, because now I've got a nice, neat, pre-folded edge already on the back side, ready for me to just pin it in place and do a little hand stitch, and then this peplum will be done and ready to go on to the garment. It'll look just fine. I've finished the hand stitching on the back side of the peplum. Don't know if you can see it. It's just little tiny picks to hold everything in place. Then I would like to show you the last thing before calling it done and ready to go on a doublet. If I hold this up on edge, you'll see that it's really, really very flat, and that in some cases you might even see that it's sort of smiling a little bit in the wrong direction. I'd like this to curve with the body just a little bit, and because I've got all of these multiple layers in here and fusible and everything, I can actually ask this to do that. I just put it over a seam roll or something, anything that is round that you could iron on top of, and I curve it over the edge, and then I'm going to hold it down just until it is a little bit cool. I do find that tapping actually helps and cools things faster. And then after I'm done with that, you'll see that there is a lovely toward the body shaped curve to this peplum, which will keep it from having any little rabbit ears that stick up and mess up the line of the doublet that I want to have. And there we are. I will call that finished and ready to go onto the doublet with all of its friends.